an international auditing company that knows the oil business, because essentially you give them the contract and you give them all those bills that Exxon and its partners are charging. They have to go over it and have to check. They might ask back Exxon to specify for what this was asked, but you don't have to spend much time on it. It just means finding or putting out a call for companies who are willing to do it, seeing what kind of costs they would basically charge for it, and then you go with one company. And then down the road, once you are up, you're basically not several years behindhand, then you can start to make maybe a condition that they have to work with a junior company in Guyana to train local people. But this is all a process. Initially, you have to be fast, get the auditing done, make sure that these costs do not expire in terms of you being able to refuse certain costs, because technically Guyana is already has expired actually the deadlines for raising a red flag on certain costs. And even if other countries are producing oil, the Norwegians are doing it for years already. Guyana has a long tradition dealing with Norway. If you need expertise and help how to do this, there's nothing wrong. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, but just get it done, get professional people doing it. The little sliver of hope that I have seen recently that I took out of the vice president's 2-hour press conference of last week that basically delayed our appearance by 1 week is the fact that they seem to be working now with experts in order to shape the PSA, but also for the refinery projects. Not the refinery projects, but for the gas-powered electricity plants, that they are basically having 2 international consulting companies helping them to assess which producer, which contractor will do the better job or should get the contract. So that's positive. We don't know the details. We have to believe what the vice president has told us. We don't know the names of these companies, that we could go back and check out these companies that have really a track record. But let's be on the positive side. At least there seems to be no longer the attitude that we can do everything ourselves. And however, I don't want to see situations that we go to Ghana to get expertise to run an NRF instead of going to Norway or to Singapore, countries that have been running sovereign wealth funds highly successful, while Ghana has essentially no track record in doing it. So these are sort of, as an observer from abroad in the diaspora, these are things that I observe. I see some improvement, but I think there's huge room to do a better job.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brantley. And now we've come to the final few minutes of our program this evening. And I'd like to ask Dr. Adams if you can also wrap up in about 3 minutes. And I'll also award the same time to Mr. Kusial and then to Dr. Brantley.
Yes, thanks, Guyana. I appreciate you having me on board once again. I think it's a nice discussion. Like I said, there are things that as you know, I'm one of the biggest advocates for production of oil. I don't think anybody in Guyana, well, I know that there are a few who would prefer not to, but I'm one of the biggest advocates for production. I think we ought to produce as much as we can, because there might be just a small window. However, we should be doing it correctly. We should be doing it safely. We should be following the laws. And the only way we're going to be following the laws is to make sure we have proper oversight, which is the Environmental Protection Agency that has been charged with that. And right now, the Environmental Protection Agency is, without question, I don't think anybody would dispute that they're not functioning the way that they should be functioning. There's no kind of capacity. The plan was there already, like I said, when I was there. And these plans were thrown aside. So we need to start with, first of all, following the rule of law and building the capacity, the agency that is going to provide the oversight. And the key part of the oversight, Kiana, you know that this year has always been my mantra. You have to have people 24/7 on board that ship or those ships to see what's going on. Now, the other part, and my good friends, this is exactly what the intent of this new PSA, this splash about this deal, is to distract from this whole renegotiation of a bad deal. You see how everybody now started talking about 10% and all the new stuff in the PSA. Now, what is really left? And the Stabroek block, by the way, is exempt. So we already have 11 billion. Who knows what's left? Is there anything really that is left outside of that 11 billion barrels? So it's a rat hole that we're running down, following, the vice president and others who come up with this gimmick, to be honest, to distract from us not following the laws for full coverage insurance. That the parent company, they're refusing to sign that. So we're distracting from that to talk about this new PSA and not to talk about the renegotiations. I think we ought to make sure that people like yourself, let's keep that conversation about parent company coverage. Tell me, why isn't the company signing a parent company guarantee to cover anything that happens? It's not costing them a dime. And when I hear ministers debating this thing in Parliament, when Minister Patterson brought it up as on the motion, and I hear ministers are saying a parent company guarantee is going to cost them money. I mean, that's absolute nonsense. It's all it is. It's signing a guarantee to say anything that happens. Why can't they do that? So those are the kinds of things that we need to fix and not run off on these rat hole chasing behind, this stuff about this new PSA. Let's deal with the current PSA where all of the resources are, not some PSA down the road that, by the way, is discriminatory as far as I'm concerned, especially to new investors that may even include Guyanese investors that would be interested. It's an unfair playing field.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adams. Over to you, Mr. Kusiel.
Yeah, so thanks again, Guyana, for hosting us tonight. So one way to measure all this oil and progress, etc., is to look, at the Guyanese population. Are they benefiting, right? So a few days ago, the World Bank said 48% of Guyanese are living on $5.50 a day. Now, in 2020, the Inter-American Development Bank actually said 41.2% of Guyanese were living on $5.50 a day. So we started pumping oil in December 2019. And if I look at those figures, we're actually going backwards, right? We went from 41% living on $5.50 a day to now 48%. But the problem is that $5.50 in 2020, because of the inflation that's going on, that's actually $5.50 is not $5.50 today. It can't buy the same amount of goods because of the inflation. So we're actually, in terms of progress, in terms of us, the Guyanese people benefiting from oil, we seem to be, at least if I look at that metric, how are the entire Guyanese population benefiting? It seems to be going in the opposite direction. Okay. Now, the other thing I want to touch on is this new PSA that they talk about 10% royalty, 10% tax, and expenses capped at 65%. So as Dr. Adams has said, for Lisa 1, we don't know when that will ever be paid off. But we know they're pumping over over 140,000, the Hess CO, the Exxon CO, all boasting about over 140,000 barrels a day. Okay. Now, if we assume that Lisa 1 will be paid off by the end of this year, and we look at next year, so if we're only getting 14.5% on Lisa 1, that's coming out to $690 million US. Okay, if we take the the PSA terms and we just apply to Lisa 1, not Lisa 2, just Lisa 1, next year with ring fencing, if we apply those terms with ring fencing, assuming Lisa 1 would have been paid off anyways if we had ring fencing in place by the end of this year. But if we apply those new PSA terms to Lisa 1, we would have ended up with 2.7 billion US just for 2023. So how does all of that work out? Those folks, those 48% of people living on $5.50 a day, you could have tripled what they would get next year. That's an extra at least $15 US for each of those folks living on $5.50 a day. So we need to, stop. We seem to be, our politicians, etc., seem to, have this inferiority complex to try to please the oil companies, and they're going to go run away, etc. No, we need to think, put the Guyanese people first, and what is in the best interest of the Guyanese people, not the oil companies and their shareholders who are making billions and billions in profits.
Thank you very much for your comment there, Mr. Kusiel. Over to you, Dr. Brandley.
I might like to start here with the whole issue of renegotiation. I think renegotiation of the production sharing agreement that governs the Stabroek oil field is unavoidable sooner or later. So I think that's a fact. I don't think that any future government or in the next general elections, this might be a huge topic. And we see already that AFC has agreed to it. I think Norton is still at APNU is still going back and forth a little bit, or doesn't want to come out. New elections are going to come up latest in 2025. So renegotiation of the oil contract is definitely an issue that won't go away. Now, having a new model PSA out there, which was done without actually consulting all the stakeholders in the country, which I would like to see in a way, just to get their input. The government can still decide what they settle on, but the way we do things here in Switzerland, that government makes a proposal, stakeholders get to see the proposal, they can put their thoughts into it, and the government makes then the decision. So I think that's the way to do it. It would be in a way in the spirit of One Guyana that President Ali is promoting the whole time, but it seems that One Guyana is just what the Ali administration believes is right, and one doesn't really listen to other opinions. Doesn't mean that you have to follow them. And let's come back to the PSA. And I had mentioned that renegotiation with Exxon is unavoidable. I think that Exxon knows this. If they are really serious, they definitely have scenarios that this might come up. So what's the best strategy? If you come up with a model PSA, shouldn't the model PSA be along the lines of how you want to get the Stabroek block production sharing agreement adjusted? Which means, and also Vince had pointed out, future investors will go and say, hey, we want the same deal like Exxon has gotten. It's no way that we're going to do this. My perspective right now is that this new PSA should basically be part of the auctioning off of these oil fields. That the 14 that the vice president has mentioned in last week's press conference. Now, if you look at these oil fields, these are small plots of land. They're 1/10, so even less of what the Stabroek block is. Now, the financial risks will be indefinitely higher. You have a smaller block. You're not allowed to have more than 3 blocks. So you can't basically move into other areas if your seismic survey of the region tells you that this area doesn't look too good. In the Stabroek block, you have a huge area. It's half the size of Switzerland. Just to mention this, even bigger than half the size of Switzerland, where you can basically move around and find these oil fields. Personally, I believe that these offered oil fields are pretty much not very attractive. The PSA that is out there that the Vice President has mentioned in not too much detail doesn't look too attractive. We can let the process go if nobody dares to bid on everybody's, and if you realize, for example, that Exxon is not bidding, then you know that this is not good conditions. So maybe we should just wait to see them. But I don't see the long-term plan to bring in, and the long-term plan has to be to have, in a way, a PSA that covers the entire offshore oil exploration area in Guyana. And I think that has to be the strategy. And I don't see it, at least the vice president has not put this out there. Maybe he's thinking about it, but usually his thoughts come out pretty clearly. So if I were the vice president, I would have a long-term strategy to align essentially the new PSA with where you want to get with the Stabroek Block PSA. Now, do I have still some time left, or are we over?
Yes, we are a bit over, but you can go ahead and finish your thoughts.
Maybe the last point I would make, and that we can maybe pick this up at some other point if you decide that this was productive. Here, it's my first time here on Kaieteur Radio, and I'm very grateful to be invited, is the NRF, Guyana Sovereign Wealth Fund.
Yes.
In my perspective, this is the most important legislation that the country has passed since its independence. Because, and as Vince said, we need to explore these oil reserves, we need to monetize them, because that's Guyana's passport to long-term prosperity. It's our last chance, in my opinion. I can't see oil resources that are that precious, that easy, of course, with foreign help, to be exploited. But we have to do it right, and we have to put money aside. And I see that we're just spending this money recklessly with no need. There's tons of money flowing into the Guyanese economy, even without us spending the NRF. And on top of it, we are still considered a low to medium income country, so we can get loans from the IMF, we can get loans from the World Bank, we can get loans or grants from the EU to finance those infrastructure projects that we want to realize. So I don't see why we should spend more than the 3% in the NRF. It would be initially small, but by 2030, we're going to have probably 30 billion of the oil profits, even at this PSA that is not very favorable to us right now. So my real concern is that we're going to spend this money right now. And if you have to save, you think twice which projects are necessary. If you start thinking about a bridge crossing the Quarantine, and you're willing to spend $200 million on such a bridge, and you realize that, for example, the ferry service was down, and there was not huge backups with trucks on the Surinamese side or on the Guyanese side. You have to ask yourself, do you really want to spend that money on a bridge when there's no traffic? Shouldn't we just get better ferries and 2 state-of-the-art ferry terminals at the fraction of that money of a bridge? And maybe in 10 years, if the ferries become limiting, then we can talk with the Surinamese. They will also have then their oil fields developed, and we can build a bridge. So I think this type of thinking is enforced if you have not endless money that you can dip out of the savings for future generations. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brandley. And on that note, I'd like to extend my heartfelt thanks and appreciation for the perspectives offered by each of you on tonight's program. It was certainly enlightening and definitely enriching to the conversation and national conversation that's needed on Guyana's oil and gas sector. So once again, gentlemen, thank you for participating in tonight's program.
Thank you, Kian.
Very much. It's been a pleasure.
Okay. To our viewers, wherever you might be, and to our listeners, thanks again for joining us. And please ensure you stay tuned to us next week, same time, same place, for further discussions on Guyana's Oil and You. Once again, gentlemen, thank you, and do have a good evening.